Welcome, everyone, to this Encore episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Our team is taking a break from regular production over the summer, but in the meantime, we have a request. If you haven't already, would you take just a few minutes to participate in our 2019 listener survey? We do this once a year, and we would really love to hear your feedback and suggestions about the program. Your input would be very helpful to us, as we're now making decisions about the content plan for the coming year. Of course, we're trying to make sure that it will be really beneficial to you, our listeners, as you share in God's great work of global missions. It's very easy to share in this. Simply visit globalmissionspodcast.com/survey, and we expect it'll take you about 5 minutes to complete it. On behalf of our team, thanks for considering this. We really appreciate your feedback. And now we're glad to re-present one of our most popular episodes.
Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new collection of trusted resources to help clarify and strengthen your participation in global missions. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone. On today's episode, we will welcome a highly experienced mission worker to help us unpack 3 major trends he sees impacting the world of missions. Our guest today is Marvin Newell, who is serving as the Senior Vice President of Missio Nexus. It's a network of evangelical mission agencies and churches and training centers across North America. I'm going to ask Marv to explain a little bit about that association in just a minute. But he and his wife, Peggy, have served in missions now for about 40 years. They have been mission workers in Asia and Indonesia in particular. And Marv is the author of several books, including his newest book entitled Crossing Cultures in Scriptures, Biblical Principles for Mission Practice. He also serves as an adjunct professor at Moody Theological Seminary. Marv, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Mags. It's a delight for me to be on with you today.
Please just take a minute to introduce your role. How are you serving at Missio Nexus, and what does that include now?
Why, sure, Mags. My position is Senior Vice President. I promote missiological awareness throughout the network, providing oversight of our learning initiatives. We have book summaries and webinars. And also, I am the general editor of our newest delivery that we do, which is the Evangelical Missions Quarterly, or EMQ.
Well, it puts you at a strategic point for sure. And Missio Nexus itself, Missio Nexus is an association. Just describe for us a little bit the vision and purpose of this association.
Well, for those that don't know, Mags, we've been around 100 years already, but with a new name that just began about 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. And our association is an association of missions. As we said, it's a matter of us being able to connect well the greater mission community across North America, that's Canada and the United States, pulling agencies together and churches that are missions-minded together, a place for them to be able to have what we call a nexus, a meeting place where we can be able to confer together, partner together, collaborate together, share information together, just kind of keeping the ball rolling in the world of missions.
If you're serving in a mission agency or in a church or some kind of training center, this would be something for you to consider. And there's some resources available to everyone. Of course, there's membership and conferences, whatnot. Invites you to become familiar with that. It really is a great strategic learning point. And that's why we've invited Marv to be part of the podcast today, too. We're going to highlight 3 major trends that are currently having an impact on how churches participate in missions. We do have a couple of other episodes that we'll put in the show notes. Episode number 60 with Rick Heemstra was studying trends in the way evangelicals are engaging in missions. And then in episode 64, Ted Essler, who's actually a colleague of Marv Newell's at Missio Nexus, talked about some trends. On today's episode, Marv's going to bring to our attention 3 mega trends we haven't yet considered on the podcast. Let's get started here. Marv, what's the first trend?
Max, as you mentioned, there are many more than just these 3, and I'm sure our listeners have heard others, like you said in those other broadcasts, which is good. So I like to focus on some that kind of get maybe overlooked at times, but they're making a real impact in the greater world of missions. My first trend that I like to speak on is called the digital revolution and evolution. We live in a very digital world more than any other previous generation. And Mags, in 2016, the world crossed over a major milestone. And that was the year when there were more mobile subscriptions than there actually are people in the world, because some people have multiple subscriptions. And so it's interesting. Some person has said that more people own mobiles than they have toothbrushes, which is an interesting take as well. And so around the globe, the thing that people make the greatest sacrifices to have and to purchase, especially in back village places, way off, in the remote areas of the world, is to get a mobile device so that they can connect with the world. And just this week, the other day, I received a message from a missionary working in Papua, Indonesia, way out there at the ends of the earth, you might say. And she says, this world has really changed in the last 5 years just with the advent of technology and what's going on with these mobile devices. And it really, really has. So that's a change that is radically impacting the way missions is done today as well.
Mm-hmm. I have seen some of these photographs at times. You mentioned some of the off the beaten trail places where we would consider it to be rural or perhaps not as developed, at least, as some of the places we live in North America. And folks will be riding a horse or riding in a buggy or something like that, but they still have their cell phone. And so it's penetrated places we might even not expect it to be.
Well, it really has. Technological and cultural changes have radically changed the way in which information is gathered and disseminated because of this phenomenon. We now operate in this digital area where storytelling and crowdsourcing are increasingly important means of sharing knowledge and also for us in sharing the gospel. And it seems, quite frankly, Mags, that we as humans are only limited by our imagination in this area.
Mm-hmm. Well, this trend is affecting missions generally. If you could bring that to the discussion, the way churches are doing missions, if we imagine the missions committee or a church wanting to do missions well from North America in particular, or from a modern world, how is it impacting the way we should do missions?
Yeah, that's a good question. And of course, many of our listeners want to make this applicable for them. And I'd say this, local churches just cannot ignore this phenomenon. There's different ways that they can interface with this. For instance, in mission promotion, just right there at the church, staying abreast with the digital revolution by making something as simple as a digital monitor as your missions display in the foyer of your church. No longer do we need to walk into our churches and see the big map of the world with the missionaries pinned all around it. Although, that's been a great way we've done it in the past. But now, to have a digital display, and there's custom made ones for missions, by the way, where you just have all that sitting up there, because what makes this so good for your congregation is that every week you can post the new prayer letters that are there, and the prayer requests can be typed right there at the station and sent out to the missionaries. And so just for our own internal, you might say, in the churches, we could use this to promote missions through our congregation, making use of it right there. I just set one of these up in my home church, Max, and it's just phenomenal what you can put up on those displays. You can put up videos from the missionary right up there in one of the sections, one of the boxes, so they can see what's going on with the missionary. The prayer cards there, the flag of the country that they're in, the map of where they are. It makes it so that it's very, very clear who your missionaries are, and you can have fresh, up-to-date information. You just need somebody who's in place that will keep updating that on a weekly basis.
Mm-hmm. And when you think about doing missions in what we've called overseas, of course, technology is uniting the world. There's this global reality now that we're not as far away from these geographic places as we used to. But how do you see that we could use technology more effectively on the receiving end of missions, the receiving areas?
Well, here's another thing that we could be doing. We as churches here in North America, we are on the cutting edge of technologies. Whenever something new comes out, we know about it, and we can supply our missionaries and their ministries. And by the way, I'd say both of those, not just the missionary, but their ministries, with the newest devices that they need to stay abreast with this world. The newest applications could be sent there. We can send short-term workers overseas to set up the missionary just for a day or two and get them familiar with the program. I mean, these are all things that we have the possibility of doing because we know what's going on, because we live in that world. Our missionaries are busy doing what they should be doing, and that's planting churches and evangelism and so forth. And for them to have this fresh wave of technology to come in from the churches to help them out and to maybe even set up their mission offices or the national churches offices with some of this stuff is a great benefit to them out there.
A few years ago, I had an opportunity to visit overseas in a creative access location, and I saw the missionaries actually working in an office that looked not unlike an office at home, so to speak, computers there, and they were on Skype. They were doing discipleship and evangelism through a Skype connection with folks who, in this case, were reluctant to meet personally yet. They were in an environment where if they met face-to-face with a Christ follower or maybe with a foreign missionary, that could really draw attention to them that they didn't want at that time. And so it allowed them to discreetly engage in these ways. And I was struck just how they were using the tools so effectively. Of course, that did lead to personal connectivity and relationships, but those initial stages were handled by technological connections.
Well, that just goes on to the next point I was going to mention, and that is our churches being intentional in sending out what we call digital missionaries. Digital missionaries, just anybody online. They don't have to be in the country that they're working in order to be a digital missionary. You can do it right from your home office right here in Canada, obviously. But, the intent is this. We have long-term missionaries and short-term missionaries, but also we need to have digital missionaries. And I think that a church that sends all three, that are engaging all three of these areas and kind of making that intentional, is a church that's out there on the cutting edge of reaching the world, because the world is on the internet. That's where you're going to meet people. And therefore, we need to have digital missionaries intentionally there and reaching out, just as you just mentioned with that little office overseas, wherever it is. And that's the beauty of it. It can be done anywhere. But we need to say, hey, how much are our missionaries engaging in digital ministries and being part of that very thing? By the way, there is a resource that I could send people to. I'll just mention it here. We could put it up on the website later. mobileministryforum.org. That's mobileministryforum.org is a great place to get started. All kinds of resources and ideas would be found there.
Marv, just before we move on, anything else you want to mention on this trend?
The countries that are advancing the most in the digital evolution today, most of them are what we call the 1040 window countries. Those countries that have been behind are gaining much more momentum and expertise. And therefore, as they're coming on board, we need to be there to meet them. So this is just another way to reach into that hard to reach areas, is through this technology.
Okay. Great overview. Digital revolution and evolution, trend number 1. Marv, what's trend number 2?
Well, I'd like to call trend number 2 the mission traffic jam. That term isn't really original with me. I heard it from somebody else, but I've decided to pick that up and run with it because I think it's very, very true. And here's, in essence, what this is about, the missions traffic jam. We hear this phrase, it's almost become hackneyed now, Mags, in the world of missions, that missions is from everywhere to everywhere. And that is true. I mean, there's missionaries that are coming from every part of the world, and it's great to see that. And the technical term that we use in the world of missions is polycentric missions, that missions is now polycentric. There's no one location. It's not Canada. It's not the U.S. It's everybody. So it's polycentric in where missions is going. And so what is going on is that, praise the Lord, there's probably more missionaries being sent from many, many more locations around the globe than ever in the history of the church. It's been estimated that there's about 410,000 Christian missionaries in the world today. When I say that, it's every stripe of missionary you can think of. I mean, we include the Catholics as well as the Protestants and so forth in that number. But if you were to divide that number of missionaries into the number of countries in the world, you only get about 1,670 or so per country. And so it's not like we're having overload of missionaries. In other words, congestion in this traffic jam is not the problem, but rather coordination is. The coordination of the work of all these missionaries so that they're not tripping over each other and doing duplications of work and duplications of funding and just, a lot of things that can happen when people aren't talking with each other or collaborating with each other or partnering with each other. That becomes the traffic jam. So for me, as I look at this, Mags, the need of today is for networks, for networking, and also partnerships. And by the way, that's the theme of our Missio Nexus conference this year.
I was just going to note that really that's Missio Nexus exists to serve, to try and make some of these connections, right?
It certainly does. We want to make this happen. We want to unclog the traffic jam, so to speak. But for churches, looking at this, it's important too, because what happens is though there's that many missionaries out there, the fact of the matter is 90% of those missionaries work in what's considered already reached world. And really only 3% go to unreached peoples. In other words, we need to get the traffic of missionaries scattered a little bit more evenly amongst especially unreached areas of the globe today.
I just want to roll back over that briefly. It's something that I try and talk about every opportunity I get, Marv, is the distribution or the coordination, you call it, of missionaries to unreached peoples.
Yes.
And you said about 3%. And the numbers here, even if it's difficult to measure these things and we're off a little bit, we can see that it's such a tiny minority of our missionary energy is going toward the unreached. Yeah. 3%, you said?
Yeah, that's what I picked up from the website that could be of help to someone who wants to look into this is thetravelingteam.org/stats. And you can get a lot of the statistics right there from that website. But it is about 3% going to the unreached peoples of the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, if we think about this again from the church point of view, do you have advice for, again, someone in the church, a pastor, a missions committee thinking through this? How should awareness of this trend affect the way a church is doing missions?
Well, I would say a church missions committee or missions pastor should be asking the question, to whom are we primarily sending our missionaries? Mm-hmm. Are unreached peoples a major thrust of our missions outreach, or are we simply supplying missionaries for works that continue to be very, very good, but are they actually reaching unreached peoples as well? And so taking a look at priorities and trying to decide how they could maybe intentionally channel people to unreached people groups and unreached areas would be good. But also, I think it's even more than that. I think that the church needs to be asking if they're moving from autonomy in their missions program to partnerships, and partnerships in the sending process. Maybe partnerships with other churches. And I've heard of churches, that have consortiums. Maybe you get 5 or 6 together and they have consortium, and those 6 will help each other send the missionaries coming out of their churches. That's a great way of doing partnerships. Also with mission organizations, I'm still a believer in the mission agency, Mags, and I love the church. The church is central to the work of missions. I believe that wholeheartedly, but the agency is there to provide the channel for that to happen. And so the mission agencies are there to do that. They have the expertise. They have the abilities to do that. Also, a church could ask this question: how are we doing in partnering with national churches overseas? Do we have a national church somewhere that we interface with, that we can be of help with without creating dependency, of course? But is there a way that we can be an encouragement to maybe some national churches that do not have the means that we have to help them on their way, that we can do that? So that kind of a thing could be done. If for those that are listening that are from mission agencies, Mags, my question to them is, are you engaging in multicultural mobilization? It's good to have your headquarters in Canada, wherever that might be in Canada, and only recruit Canadians. But hey, how about those workers that are from those other countries of the world that are viable members as well? Are you in some way engaging a way to mobilize them under your banner and into your organization to do that?
Well, it's a great observation. The agency that I serve with, Send International, is about 20% non-North American at this point in our personnel.
Oh, good.
We're making some strides there, but trying to grow in this and at the same time, trying to keep a focus on the unreached places. We do appreciate that the Lord calls people to serve in certain places, and we want to be obedient to the Lord's call wherever He calls us to. My urging to committees and to churches is to increasingly pray over these unreached people groups and ask the Lord to raise up workers to go to those places. So. Well, we've heard these 2 trends, first about technology, the revolution and evolution of technology, and now the missions traffic jam. In just a moment, we're going to have Marv go to trend number 3. Just before we get to that, we'd like to share with you this resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
SIM Canada is convinced that no one should live and die without hearing God's good news. We believe that He has called us to make disciples in communities where He is least known. Use your skills, share the gospel, and make disciples. Check out sim.ca to learn more. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we're back with Marv Newell of Missio Nexus, who is helping us unpack 3 global mission trends that will be helpful for churches to consider as we want to do a great job at global missions. So far, Marv has talked about the digital revolution and then about the missions traffic jam. Marv, let's turn our attention to the third and final theme. What is theme number 3?
Well, yes, the third theme happens to be economic resources, Mags. We can't ignore the fact that it takes finances to help the mission cause and to push it along. And just as an automobile needs gas to fire up the engine so that the mobile can move on, so missions requires financial resources to fuel the movement, the ongoing movement. And so it's good to stop and think, okay, where are the financial resources in the world? And there's some really good resources on the internet. And I'd like to point out one to our listeners that would help them this. The World Development Indicators database of the World Bank, that's World Development Indicators database of the World Bank, has a beautiful graphic that shows where the economic resources of the world happen to be. And when you take a look at that, I have it sitting in front of me right now, you see that North America has about 30%, that's US, Canada, and Mexico. East Asia has about 31%, and that's China, Japan, and many of those East Asian countries. And then smack in the middle is Europe, about another 30%. And then the rest of the world is the last 10% if you put them all together. And so that's where the resources of the world happen to be. And so we have the ability, because of the resources God has entrusted to both Canada and the U.S., to really promote the mission cause, because finances are there for that very thing. When you take a look at the world's largest economies, Mags, the GDP, gross domestic product, of the 10 largest countries, well, the U.S. is number 1, but Canada comes in right there at number 10. And so Canada is in the top 10 of the world's largest economies. That's going to change over time. We know that as time goes on, with the advent of so much that's going on economically in Asia at this time, that they're projecting down the road that probably China, India, and maybe even Indonesia will be the top 3 by 2050. So that's only like 30 years from now. So that's the next generation of missions. But let's stop and think about where we are today. We are in a position here in Canada to use our resources to help fund the mission project. Now, I know that many times as we go out and do fundraising and we struggle to meet budgets and all, it's kind of hard when we're looking at the trees that are around us to become kind of our challenge in finding economic resources, to think that when you put them all together and look at the forest from above, that there's so much resource that's available. But it's true. That's something that we need to steward now. It's something that God wants us to be very much not just attuned with, but using for His glory. I subscribe to the view of, there was Larry Barkett and others that said that God has blessed both Canada and the United States financially for the simple reason of evangelizing the world. And therefore, we need to know that these economic realities are part of the stewardship that we need to be part of. And so, when you say, well, then what way does the church view this in the world of missions? I would just say this. The old hymn that we all know are so familiar, it says this: "Give of thy sons to bear the message glorious, and give of thy wealth to speed them on their way." We can give, some families give of both of those, their sons and their wealth. Others maybe don't have the children to do that, but they do have the resources. And so we can't be stingy. And we need to see the bigger picture that God's doing in the world today and say, yes, we need to devote our resources. We have these resources. Many countries of the world, when I think of many of the majority world countries that some of these mission movements are starting to evolve from and come from, their mission projects are on a financial shoestring, Mags. They hardly have a dime to send their missionaries, and yet they tried to do that. Just this week, I had a mission write me this week, Mags, and said, we know we don't want to create dependency overseas. We will not support pastors, national pastors, and evangelists. That's their job. But when it comes to their outreach to the world, we think that we should be financially engaging with them to help push that on. And I said, yep, you're right. I believe that area where they do not have the wherewithal to do it, but we do, is an area that we can help them with their resources.
Mm-hmm. Wow, what an important topic to wrestle with. You've touched on a few things. Just rolling back a little bit to what we call the goers and the senders, I like to ask when I speak at a church, we talk about goers being the people that will lay down their lives and move to a place where mission workers are needed. They will take up their lives in another place. They will go there. But there will be senders who come around them to make that possible. Finances is one of them. It's an important element of it. And I like to ask this question. In getting global missions done, then, which is more important, the goer or the sender? And we need to be very careful how we answer that because
we do.
Because they're both essential, right?
Oh, they're both essential. They're both essential, and there's no easy answer to that. Obviously, you need both, just like a bicycle needs two tires to run down the road and so forth. Both of them are important, and sometimes we do not give enough recognition to the senders. We applaud and give accolades to the ones that go, and that's good. But the churches that are backing them up, the individuals and so forth, those funds are just as important as the person on site overseas that is doing the work of missions there. I think that churches need to just candidly sit down and look at their annual budget and look at how much of that goes to the world of global outreach, missions, and so forth, and ask themselves the question, is this adequate? Can we do more? Or can we pat ourselves on the back and say we're doing enough? I mean, I just think it's important that we just don't gloss over this and say, oh, yeah, we need to support a few more missionaries or send a little bit more money over. We need to actually intentionally do budgeting in a way that takes into account that, if at least 10% of the budget is not in the missions, then why is that so? If it's 20%, well, great. And if it's even more than that, even better. But I think being intentional in the budgetary process is important.
I'd like to ask you to comment on another idea, Marv, just from your vantage point. We see in these days that the Lord is raising up more and more workers from the majority world. The goers, if I may, are coming from the majority world increasingly as opposed to the Western world. However, as you've noted, the vast majority of financial resources are still in the Western world. Just talk a little bit about that imbalance and that reality and where you may have seen tension in that or where you've seen it working well.
Well, Mags, there's always the larger issues involved here. One is that, yes, it's true that we have the resources here in the West, more financial resources than many other countries. But that does not mean that they don't have resources. And actually, many East Asian countries have just as much financial resources. When you think of Korea and China, by the way, by the year 2050, mainland China is projected to be the largest funder of Christian missions in the world by that time. And so we know that things are going to be shifting that way. But back to your question about some of these very more underprivileged, you might say, areas of the world, we need to be very, very wise as we engage them with funding for their projects. Money corrupts, and if it's not accountable for, it corrupts absolutely. And we need to be very, very careful in how all this is handled. But that doesn't mean we should be stingy either. And so finding the balance, and I'd say the important thing is this, building the relationship and having the trust in that relationship. We talked about collaboration earlier. That collaboration needs to be built on trust and being very wise in the way funding is handled and maybe channeling money to some of these majority world missionaries or even projects that they would have. I told a missionary this week, I said, when you send your missionaries, the majority world sends their missionaries overseas, the national church there should supply their salary and things like that. But what we can do from the West is provide their transportation to the field, provide their housing on their field, maybe even provide a vehicle for, those are the extra kind of things that really are needed for that missionary to function well, that these places usually don't have the money to do, but they can fund the salary of the missionary. And that's asking them to do their part in a very intrinsic way. And then we can fill in the other things that, quite frankly, are not a burden to us. I mean, all of us can pay for the airline tickets and stuff like that. They look at those $2,000 airline tickets for a family of four and say, it's impossible for me to get to where God's called me. Well, that's where we can come in and I think be a partner with them in those kinds of very practical ways.
Well, this is very good. I'm going to mention just quickly in the show notes, we will include some other episodes about globalization, missionaries coming from everywhere, going everywhere. You'll find a list in the show notes of other episodes that explore this theme even a little more deeply. Marv, this has been very helpful. Of course, we've just scratched the surface on these important themes. We will include in the show notes some of the diagrams that one in particular that Marv mentioned will include there. But Marv, I wonder if there's someone on a missions committee listening or a pastor, someone in church leadership, and they'd like to learn some more about this, what resources would you recommend to them?
I would say this. Here's 2 books that I would suggest. One is called Pressure Points by J.D. Payne, where he talks about 12 trends. And then the other one is a new resource just the beginning of this past year. It's called Window to the World, Knowing the Need in Our World. And that's by a writer named Andrew Knight. That's Knight, Andrew Knight.
We will include those in the show notes as well. Those of you that are familiar with the podcast know that JD has been on the show a number of times, Marv, and he's helped unpack some of those things. So all these beautifully fits together. If some of our listeners would like to follow up with you, Marv, and get in touch with you, how could they do that?
Well, let me make a very simple email that they can contact me. It's simply marvnewell@gmail.com.
I will make sure that's included, of course, in the show notes as well. And with that, we will say a big thank you to you, Marv, for just helping us scan over these macro issues, get a bit of a better understanding, and stir our thinking a bit. Thanks so much for spending this time with us.
You bet, Max. Thanks for having me on.
Well, this concludes our conversation with Marv. Thanks for joining us. Remember that you can find show notes at globalmissionspodcast.com, which will include links to all the resources that were mentioned today, including a few of the graphs that Marv referred to. You can also connect with us on Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. As our regular listeners already know, we're glad to hear from you with suggested topics or interviews you'd like us to consider. And if you enjoyed this episode, we'd invite you to subscribe to the program in your favorite podcast app. We would sure appreciate a review as well on iTunes or whatever application you're using. That's all for today. This episode was brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.